How close is China to a financial crisis? And is the banking system of the world's second largest economy really at risk? Listen up. Over the last 4 decades, the Chinese economy has undergone one of the greatest growth and development processes in history. During this time, and with an annual growth rate of almost 10%, China has gone from being a country of impoverished peasants to becoming an industrial superpower, full of large companies and modern metropolises. Along the way, according to the World Bank data, more than 700 million people left poverty behind. To give you an idea, this is more than the entire population of Latin America, Spain, and Portugal combined. We are talking about one of the processes that has most influenced the global economy over the last 40 years. There is no doubt, China has been one of the great drivers of the planet. However, this situation could now be at risk. VisualPolitik community, in a past video, we already told you about how the Chinese model could be about to face a deep economic crisis. We talked about the first major crisis since at least 1976. However, in that video, we left one issue pending: the possible contagion of the crisis to the entire Chinese banking system. In case you don't know, China is a very unusual economy. Since almost 2008, its productivity levels have stagnated, so that today they are very low. Therefore, in order to try to reach the growth targets set by the government, they have to invest a lot of resources, investments that is financed with debt. And since the returns are low, this has caused the debt of families, companies, and the government combined to soar above what is usual, for example, in Europe or even the United States. Remember this chart? Well, that's exactly what we're talking about. But that's just the beginning. Pay close attention to this other graph. In it, you can see how, during recent months, the delinquency rate of Chinese high-yield credits has multiplied, which is the highest risk debt. This increase in non-performing loans coincides with the bad period the Chinese economy is going through. Keep in mind, for instance, that during the second quarter of 2022, China recorded its worst growth figure in 30 years, with the exception of the coronavirus. And remember also that youth unemployment is already close to 20%, while the real estate sector is imploding. We talked about all of this in a previous video. However, perhaps the most worrying of all are the signals coming from the Chinese banking system, and above all, the effect that the bursting of the real estate bubble may have on it. But let's start at the beginning. During April 2022, 4 rural banks in Henan province were forced to freeze nearly $6 billion in deposits overnight. The official reason given by the government was that the activity of these banks had been suspended because, apparently, they had taken deposits from other provinces through online intermediaries. This is something that Chinese regional banks are strictly prohibited from doing. However, there were several reasons that fueled the suspicion. The fact that all deposits were frozen, and not only those collected abroad, the fact that the government tried to silence the affected customers, even by sending thugs to attack them, and the fact that the process dragged on for months caused suspicion and fear to multiply rapidly. And so, suddenly, a question spread throughout the land. Did the real estate crisis have something to do with these banks suddenly having to suspend operations? The Henan crisis began to be resolved on July 12th, when financial regulators began to order partial payments to affected clients. However, despite this, doubts have not disappeared. And the question is, could the real estate pinch trigger a financial crisis in China as it did in the Great Crisis of 2008? Well, let's take a look.
The Financial Explosive.
The bursting of the real estate bubble, the fall in housing prices, and the bankruptcy of many developers have triggered uncertainty. For example, in mid-July, a group of home buyers with properties under construction known as We Need Home threatened to stop paying their mortgages if the government did not guarantee that construction would be completed. By the end of that same month, according to data gathered by Bloomberg, there were already more than 320 projects affected by this boycott. And for a country like China, where the government has enormous social control, that's a lot. But let's start at the beginning. China's banking system is largely state-owned and represents a key part of the government's economic policy. As we have already told you on several occasions here on VisualPolitik, China is a very unusual country. Here, the government plays a very important role in economic planning. This means that when the government sets a target for economic growth, everyone has to work to achieve it. In the case of banks, this means giving more or less credit. For years, this did not cause any problems. However, as growth rates slowed, especially after the 2008 crisis, banks were pressured to offer more. The idea was that the more cheap credit they provided, the more projects could be implemented, which in turn would increase economic growth and allow the government's objectives to be met. The problem we saw before is that this policy has multiplied the debt in circulation in China to levels much higher than those of Western countries, and that's not the end of it. Over the years, this policy has made many of the projects financed by the banks unprofitable. And the question is, why would anyone want to build projects of dubious profitability? Well, basically for the same reasons why banks are forced to lend their money. Local governments and public companies have to meet the targets set by the government. If the growth of the economy slows down, then they have to spend more money. For example, by building infrastructure that's not needed. The problem is that if a project is not very productive, there is a risk that it will not generate sufficient resources to repay the debt incurred to carry it out. In other words, over the years, Chinese banks have been forced to grant more risky loans to meet the targets set by the government. And of course, something very similar has happened with the real estate market, thanks in large part to the bank's policies, housing demand, and prices skyrocketing. For years, this policy spurred the construction of tens and tens of millions of homes across the country, creating millions of jobs. In addition, thanks to steadily rising home prices, family wealth continued to grow. China was getting richer, and real estate had a lot to do with the whole process. It was, so to speak, one of the great economic engines of the country, and behind it were the banks. The problem, as always, is debt. Families and real estate developers alone have accumulated bank debts of $7.5 trillion, an amount of money to which we have to add what companies have also invested in the real estate sector. We could easily be talking about more than $11 trillion, and maybe even much more. And that's a lot of cash. But what if you want to look at it from another perspective? Well, look at this graph. Here you can see how the amount of household debt relative to income has tripled in just a few years. So far, more than 26 real estate developers have gone bankrupt, and according to estimates by the British consulting firm Capital Economics, there are more than 100 million empty homes in China. So it is very likely that housing prices will continue to fall for some time and that construction will slow down. This may lead to an increase in unemployment, which in turn may worsen the Chinese crisis and increase delinquencies. Under such a scenario, the question is, who would be most affected by this situation? Precisely the banks.
China banks may face $350 billion in losses from property crisis.
According to estimates by Standard & Poor's and Deutsche Bank, between 6.4 and 7% of all Chinese mortgages may be at risk of default, a situation that, if it does occur, could spread to many other sectors. Now, the question is, faced with such a risk, what exactly does the government intend to do? Well, let's take a look.
Referring to the manual.
The Chinese banking system is enormous, perhaps too large for the state to rescue it easily if necessary. To give you an idea of what we're talking about, at the end of July, loans in the Chinese banking system amounted to more than $30 trillion, approximately 175% of GDP. What's more, we must bear in mind that in China, public revenues account for little more than 1/5 of GDP. And to top it all off, an important source of public revenue is precisely the sale of land and real estate activity itself. So if it comes to that, any bank bailout could put the Chinese government in a very difficult situation. And that is why Beijing is very clear that the number one priority is to prevent a financial crisis from occurring. They have to make sure that things don't get out of control at all costs. And to do that, they need to force a soft landing in an industry that has a lot of problems. And that is precisely what explains news like this.
China surprises with a rate cut to combat the economic slowdown.
The Chinese authorities want to prevent the crisis from deepening, so they are implementing expansionary monetary and fiscal policies, as well as all kinds of regulatory changes. On the one hand, they are reducing interest rates and increasing financing for companies, including real estate developers. The idea is to stabilize this sector and allow banks to gradually divest themselves of riskier assets while boosting investment in other sectors. Then, on the fiscal side, the government has asked large public companies to increase their hiring levels, and it is also launching a huge infrastructure plan to help offset the slowdown in the real estate industry.
China readies $1.1 trillion to support Xi's infrastructure push.
And if that were not enough, if necessary, the government itself could even buy some of the most problematic real estate assets from the banks.
China plans real estate fund worth up to $44 billion for distressed sector, source says.
And the truth is that China has many strengths in this area. For example, it has some of the largest sovereign wealth funds and pension funds in the world. Funds that could be mobilized to buy real estate assets in order to try to stabilize things. However, just a moment, because as you've seen, we're talking about a real estate sector and a financial system that are too large for the state to be able to easily control this process. If the crisis deepens, we could see holes of hundreds of billions of dollars in the Chinese banking system, which by themselves would be capable of putting Xi Jinping's government on the ropes. In addition, as we've already mentioned, it is not at all clear that the old formula will work this time. China already has too much debt and too much infrastructure for monetary and fiscal stimulus to work. In other words, if it's not brought under control, we could be facing the first phase of something like the Great Chinese Crisis of 2008. Obviously, the future is not written, and we have already talked about the Chinese fortresses in past videos. But be that as it may, this is a real risk today, and it is to a large extent what explains why capital outflows from the country have accelerated, and also why Chinese stocks have plummeted. The good news, perhaps, is that the Chinese government seems to be well aware of the risks. But at this point, it's your turn. Will the Chinese government manage to stabilize the situation and avoid a financial crisis? What do you think they should do to prevent things from getting even worse? As always, leave us your impressions below in the comments, and let's open up a debate. If you found this video interesting, don't forget to like it, and take a look at our sister channel, VisualEconomic. And of course, subscribe to VisualPolitik if you haven't already done so. Thank you very, very much for watching. All the best. I'll see you next time.